we had this very hard task of like, okay, well, we need to design an 8-player game without ever being able to test it until, this technology is done. I had just started on the team, and the team was really enthusiastic about auto chess, and I had never heard of it. So I sort of watched some of the other designers playing it. I thought it was really cool, so I decided to try it at home. And then Pat assigned me to make my first Tavern Brawl, and I told him I had this crazy idea to try to make some sort of like 1-versus-1 translation of auto chess. My goal was sort of to try to make something a little more like chess-like than auto chess was, since it's a 1-versus-1 game and Hearthstone's a turn-based game. And so I started out with trying to prototype this very complicated combat system, and it's very similar to what we still have in Battlegrounds now. It was enough to sort of show people hey, there's a really fun game here that we can sort of explore.
Okay, each turn goes roll, buy, action.
When do you go back to work again?
I started working on the first prototype for the Tavern Brawl in about mid-February, and then we really started to buckle down around mid-March. Yeah, it happened kind of virally on the team. I was on a one-on-one with one of our leaders of the Hearthstone team, and I told him what I was working on, and he was just really interested in it. So I showed it to him, and he thought it was super cool, so he told some of our design leads about it. And so they started coming to ask me about it, and they were like, hey, can we play a game of it? And so they sat down and played a 1-versus-1 game, and they spent an hour playing the first game. They turned off turn timers because they wanted to see how much strategy there was. And so after they played their hour-long game, they were like, there's something really cool here. And I think the leaders of our team got together and they started talking, and I came in one morning, they're like, we're gonna put a team together to sort of flesh this out. Yeah, it was really different. We didn't even have buttons to do your actions, we just had action cards. It was sort of similar to the cards you'd have in the tavern for a dungeon run adventure. So you'd have a card that would sort of buy minions, so to speak. Instead of having minions appear on the board, since you're playing a 1-versus-1, you're always on the same board. So instead of what we have now, you had a card that would let you discover minions. And the cost of that card would sort of increase during the turn that you used it, so it got more expensive to buy minions. And you actually had to cast minions from your hand for their actual cost, too. So there was a lot of decision making around that. We also had a card for rearranging your minions, because we didn't have the ability to do that. If you remember, a long, long time ago, we had a chess event, and we had a way that you could rearrange your chess pieces, and you can actually rearrange your board in any way with just move left. And so I gave you a card that let you move left and sort of just return to your hand, so it was a very tedious process of doing that over and over again. It was a pretty small team. It sort of expanded over the course of the development process. Originally we grabbed an engineer basically from every vertical on our team, so we had someone who specialized in gameplay and server engineering and feature engineering. But every engineer on our team had to flex a bit. It was a very sort of game jammy sort of team. And I think we had about 10 people at the start, and we were plus or minus a couple of people in between. We had a couple of people join to sort of help out with specific needs. Sometimes we had an extra UI designer jump in to help out with something. We had tons of design input from everyone on the Hearthstone team. But especially a lot of our final designers, they did a lot of playtesting for us as well in the process. In the first month or so, we were sort of sitting down, we were having meetings every day to sort of try to figure out what direction we could take this with the resources we had. And we had a very ambitious engineer who was like, guys, I think we could put 8 players into a game, and I think I could do it. And we were shocked. But we decided to see what he could do. So we gave him about 2 months to sort of hack away at the code to try to make that work. And then we had this very hard task of okay, well, we need to design an 8-player game without ever being able to test it until this technology is done. Right away we were like, okay, well, if we're gonna have 8 players, we probably can't have a turn-based game anymore. And so we started to figure out, like, how can we have a simultaneous sort of Hearthstone experience going? And of course, we were inspired by auto chess, so we definitely learned some things from, what they had done. But we also learned a lot about things that maybe we didn't want to do for our game, and how could we sort of highlight our cards and our minions and just like the UI of Hearthstone. And so that sort of led us to, well, maybe we can sort of have these minions on the board. We were, of course, really inspired by the Tavern and the Dalaran heist. And so we started exploring, like, could we have shopping and buying minions and stuff on the board?
I'll put it on your tab.
And it really like opens up sort of your hand to have different things or just not be as tedious. So once we started exploring that, everything started to come together off of that. Bob is super important. It's actually a funny story because Bob was not always there in Battlegrounds. It was something actually probably that came about halfway through that we were like, why aren't we just putting like Bob, at the front of this? Because we could be in a tavern. We actually went through a pretty like long back and forth about like, what do we call this? Like, what is the theme of this game mode? We had sort of toyed around with the idea of like being on a battlefield for a long time, but we hadn't really defined the fantasy of like what the transition was between like, why are you on the battlefield, like buying minions and playing them, and like, so we decided like, well, maybe you should like go back to the tavern and then you go out to the battle and you come back and chill in the tavern. And that's sort of why we have a very like distinct music difference even between the two phases of the game. And once we were at the tavern, we're like, of course, well, now we just have to put Bob, right?
Welcome back. How's it going out there?
At the start, actually, the first prototype I had ever made, there were no heroes. You had no hero powers. And it was still very early, but I sort of liked the idea of being on sort of like this blank canvas when you started a game. But over time, we felt like we wanted to make it feel a bit more Hearthstone-y. And like heroes are just one of the most awesome things about Hearthstone, and they're super exciting. Hero power, it felt a little naked without hero powers. And so Mike, actually, who was the other designer on the team, brought the idea like, hey, what if we made a bunch of heroes and had hero powers? And I was like, oh, yeah, I mean, that could work. So we started working on it, and we came up with some really cool ones. We're like, oh, wow, this is really adding another element to what we had. And then eventually we were like, wouldn't it be cool if you could like pick your hero at the start? Because at the time we just had like 8 heroes. You just randomly get one at the start. And so we decided to make some more heroes. And Hearthstone likes to do, pick 1 out of 3 a lot. So we decided maybe you should get to pick from 3. Our UI designers were working hard on this sort of like scoreboard that you see in the game now. And we thought like it'd be kind of weird if there were 2 of the same hero showing up there. It'd be kind of confusing and hard to sort of distinguish them. And so we decided, well, I guess we need everyone to have unique heroes. And so we're like, guess we gotta make 24 before we finish. So that's sort of how we landed at 24 for our launch. And then we loved the idea of just going above that afterwards, so we just kept making them. We tested one where all the minions cost 2, and you started at Tavern Tier 3. But you couldn't go higher than that. So you basically could never increase your tavern. For many reasons, it was very busted, and we decided not to ship that one. And it was part of how we ended up at Millhouse's Hero Power, is we spent a lot of time iterating on the idea of like, how can we make minions cost 2 and not just have this be super overpowered for most of the early game.
Prepare to face the mighty Millhouse Mana Storm!
That was one of the craziest ones we tried, for sure. The very first designs we had sort of a progression of like, well, we know we want the minions to get stronger and more exciting as the game goes on. And we didn't know exactly how we wanted to identify that for the player, like how would they know that that's happening? And so we decided we should just give them the control of that, and it just helps them connect to like where they are in the game and sort of have some context. And so the the cost of that sort of had to play into how much do minions cost, because we want this decision of like, well, should I just buy minions now, or should I, sort of invest in the future and go up with that. So the very first thing we had for minions was actually that discover idea where the cost of a minion you bought would increase every turn. So if you bought one minion, maybe the first one costs 2 and the second one costs 3 in that turn, and then it would reset every turn. So we played around with a lot of like weird numbers, stuff like that, and we thought it was kind of interesting. It had some cool gameplay, but it was a bit confusing and it got a bit exhausting almost. There was a puzzle, which was something we were looking for, is to create a puzzle on each turn. But we wanted the puzzle to also be fun to solve, so we decided that we could still make a really fun puzzle to solve each turn with flat costs.
Steady hand.
And then we decided to move the scalability of the cost to actually tavern tiering, which seemed like a much more easy to understand sort of number that was changing. It started out just like when I was first prototyping the Tavern Brawl. I was of course really inspired by a lot of minions. So the very first time I ever put a sort of minion pool together, something like Cave Hydra's there. And it was part of why I started with the combat when I was prototyping, was that I was trying to find a combat where I could highlight mechanics in Hearthstone that I thought were really cool, and maybe they didn't ever shine in Hearthstone. So something like Cave Hydra played really well into the combat system. And death rattle effects are really cool in the combat system. So I always like playing with weird cards in any card game, and especially in Hearthstone. And so I really wanted to try to highlight a lot of our collectible minions maybe that didn't really see as much life. It's funny to see like something like Cobalt Guardian, right, has become like one of the pillars of Battlegrounds, but it was never like a huge minion in collectible. So that's sort of why we started with collectible minions. We also just wanted Hearthstone players to be able to relate back to those and sort of be able to connect some stories of the past to these minions and see them in a new light. And we thought that was super cool. We also needed to make some new minions to help supplement holes and archetypes that we were trying to create and really help highlight some of the cool stuff that you can do in Battlegrounds. It was actually a really hard task to sort of curate that minion list. And it went through many iterations. There was a point where the sort of number of minions was significantly smaller than it is now. And over time we kept playtesting and expanding on it and building more archetypes into it where we could, and we just thought it became way more fun that way. We knew that it was gonna be hard to make, a game mode in Hearthstone that just like didn't have battle cries. We went through a lot of ideas of like, well, maybe you play a battlecry minion and its effect happens at the start of combat or something like that. And we just thought it was really confusing. But we knew that one of the things we really liked about what Battlegrounds was becoming was that you were building up this thing, this sort of warband of minions over time. And so, one day we were just like, what if the battle cries and the buffs that you give them are just sort of permanent, they're just there. And that's part of like what those minions are. They're almost like spells, right? And so we just started playtesting with that, and it ended up being like this really cool thing. And it was something that people could sort of jump on and quickly understand. They might have a question mark about like, well, like what happens to this battle cry next turn? But you go into combat, you come back, and you realize the buff is still there. You're like, wow, that's like a really aha moment for the player too.
You're good at this.
So it was fun actually. It was really fun to try to sort of redefine some of the mechanics in Hearthstone and see how they would work in Battlegrounds. And a lot of them just work as is. So the first time that I sat down to make the combat, I knew I wanted something for players to be able to understand easily. I knew the combat was going to be confusing at some point, and it's part of the joy of the auto battlers is that you're sort of a little confused about like what's going to happen and what's happening. But I think it's important that the players have something to hold on to and be like, I understand this part of it. And so I felt like starting with this idea of going left to right was something that would be really easy for people to pick up on and at least have some understanding of like, well, I know my minions are gonna go this way. The very first version had your minions attacking from left to right, and they would always attack your opponent's leftmost minion. And so it's sort of just like, you know, all your minions sort of went after that one guy, and then it would go down the sort of line until combat resolved. And it was super interesting in the context of this 1v1 prototype. But as soon as, you know, we expanded on that into an 8-player environment where you weren't going to have as much context on what your opponents were doing, we just felt like that wasn't going to be as interesting anymore. It wasn't going to be quite as interesting of like a chess game even. One of our final designers actually suggested the idea of like, what if just all the attacks were random forever? And so I sort of split the difference and gave it a shot with random attacks, because you still have this sort of strategic depth of like, well, I understand how my minions are going to go, and I can sort of make some educated guesses about like where they're going to go here and there. But at some point it creates this very large range of variance of your experience in every combat even. I think that's one of the main reasons that Battlegrounds is so replayable, is even every combat is a bit of a different experience, even though you have the same sort of warband going. And then of course we wanted to obey taunt, because it's just such an iconic Hearthstone mechanic.
You shall not pass.
And we felt like it just made sense, and it actually added a very interesting and complex sort of aspect to how you set up your minions and how you even select your minions. We got the game sort of systems mostly locked down probably about halfway through our development. So I would say probably around month like 4 or 5. And then we spent a lot of time polishing a lot of those details. We had a couple different UI designers sort of helping out at different times on Battlegrounds. So we went through some late iterations on the UI. Part of the reason we have even like dragging to buy, like dragging to your hero to buy and dragging to Bob to sell, is because we had another UI designer come in and sort of give that feedback, and he sort of redesigned something, and we put it together really fast because we thought it was a cool idea. So we definitely spent a lot of time polishing on just like interaction and stuff like that, and we're still working on that now. It's a really hard challenge, and we know we want to shake things up, but we also have to be careful, right? It's super important that players sort of have an understanding of what they're getting into. So it's super important that there's like these archetypal pillars almost for players to relate back to. So if we want to sort of transform the meta or change an archetype, I think it would be very dangerous if we sort of just like ripped out all the minions and we put in brand new minions. Because then when the player queues up, they're going in and they don't even necessarily know what they're looking for in the future. And it's sort of shown over time that some of the very minor balance tweaks that we make will shake up the meta very drastically, right? When we moved Junkbot to Tier 5 from Tier 4, for example, the metagame started shifting very heavily. When we removed Nightmare Amalgam, we knew that was going to heavily shake up the metagame, and just things like stats like health were going to matter more because poison wasn't as accessible. So there's a lot of moving parts, and we definitely want to keep updating the game with cool, new, interesting heroes, and of course, new minions. We've got dragons coming, but we want players to sort of understand what a game of Battlegrounds is going to feel like when they press that play button.